The year is 399 BC. In an agora, an individual stands and facing 501 of his fellow citizens, and he's charged with, first of all, disregarding or convincing others that the gods don't exist, and secondly, for corrupting the youth. How did this influential individual, this man who'd spent 70 years of his life influencing others, trying to change others' thought patterns to help them discover what a good life is all about, how does he now stand facing execution for things that are absolutely not true? Well, that's the tension of Socrates' life and the tension of the end of his life, because he ends up giving up his life for this cause. Socrates was important, and today I chose him as the person I'll share in my case study because I believe he provides a prototype of an example of a social movement leader. We don't have many from that time or period in history, but he stands out as one. I'd love to share with you today, number one, why I believe he is a social movement leader. Secondly, what kind of leader I believe, or what lens of leadership we should look at when considering his life. And finally, the conclusions we can draw from that. I want to start with the context of this whole timeline because it's so far removed from our experience. Greece or Hellas was a country at that time that was embroiled with conflict, like much of the world. That there was a lot of strife, a lot of war. Typically, they were led by oligarchy or by dictators. They had some type of aristocratic system for governance around 600 BC. But it wasn't one that was employing what we know now as a democracy and what Socrates would come to know as he was kind of brought into this situation. But before him, there was a lot of wars and strife. There were wars from the Persians were attacking and others were threatening their existence. But something began to happen in Greece that didn't happen around the world for a lot later in history. An individual named Solon, a poet, began to talk about the voice of the people and give them a say in matters, or at least a desire to. Cleisthenes, an aristocrat, decided to give a voice to the people, which is the first occurrence of it we know, a recorded occurrence of that in history. Began to give them a voice in public matters because of necessity more than desire, but nonetheless, an idea caught hold in the people of Athens. Turmoil continued to happen with Persian kings, both Darius and Xerxes attacking. But again, that ecclesia, that idea of community, was embedded now in the people of Athens, if not the rest of Greece. Now, the Spartans were helping to push back the Persian attacks, and a sort of alliance was formed between the polis, or the city-states of Greece. And then Socrates was born. And around his birth was when the Athenians decided, let's not just talk about this idea of ecclesia, let's become a self-governing people. What a dramatic change from dictatorships and tyranny now to the people saying we can govern ourselves. We choose to lead ourselves. They developed an elaborate system where people were included in every office of society by random, and everyone would have a chance to do so. What a proud and brave new way to think. At the dawn of democracy, thousands of years ago, something we hold very dear and cherish now, was something that was at the very ground roots in Socrates' birth, around the time that he was born. And he was born into it. His thoughts reflected that. He thought there was no limit to what we could understand or do. And he chose to dedicate his life to helping not just himself to understand what the inner individual needs, but to challenge the world around him. And he would go to public places and he would have conversations and debate and refine his thinking and hopefully challenge others to think more clearly, more solidly, not interpreting things falsely or incorrectly, but to learn how to know, not just for themselves what's good, but how to live well. And this was all good and well. People flocked from all over the world to hear Socrates talk. And the Athenians, they held him in revere. He had plays written about him, which if you have a play or a movie written about you today during your life, during the course of your life, you know you're important because people want to go see plays about you. And that was the case with Socrates. But something very important happened after he formed the academy and developed this institution with Plato. The Peloponnesian Wars occurred. And this was a war with the Spartans, and the Athenians suffered great losses as a result of it. Some estimates have the fighting men population of Athens at one point 200,000, and after the Peloponnesian Wars, around 20,000 fighting men inhabited the city of Athens. A great destruction took place, and their city was left asunder, and they were very proud people who now were left with very little to hold or to claim. And here's Socrates still 40, 50 years later, walking around challenging people, challenging the gods, challenging thoughts, challenging ideas, challenging preconceived ideas that others came into every day with, and forcing them to think more clearly about their conclusions. And it grated against people. And eventually, an individual named Meletus and several other colleagues brought charges against him, and they were heard because people were fed up with hearing Socrates talk about what was wrong. They wanted to have solace, not challenge. And so these charges were brought to Socrates, and he faced the death penalty. But before we get to his death and the trial, we need to decide, was he in fact a social movement leader? Stagenborg and Morris define this social movement leader this way: a strategic decision maker who inspires and organizes others to participate in social movements. Pretty straightforward there. Let's break that down. For the remainder of this talk, I'd like to use sort of a, I don't know, maybe it's a silly tactic here, but I like the idea of, in Law and Order and things, they have those different maps where they connect the ideas and decide if someone's the right candidate the right suspect for whatever they're charging. And I want to see, is Socrates a leader, in fact? And so we're going to kind of walk that through. First of all, from the definition, let's work in reverse. Was it a social movement that he was a part of? Well, it's hard for us to think of it in those terms today because we benefit from the experience of what took place beginning in 400 BC, around that 500, the 5th century BC, all the way to now. We cherish democracy, but we don't always understand where it began. It began in Athens, Greece, in the time of Socrates. It's not just the political structure, but the moral structure, more importantly, the intellectual freedom that they experienced. And Socrates was on the front end of that. He was the individual defining it. And for the course of his life, 70 years, was responsible for leading that charge. And that is a movement to today that we benefit from, but minimized because it's been so established. The idea of intellectually thinking, considering, challenging ideas, really deciding for yourself if it was true. Socrates led that. Was there participation, though? There needs to be participation based on this definition. Well, absolutely. Again, people were flocking from all over the Aegean to hear Socrates teach. It was a privilege to hear him. But he wasn't making a name for himself. He would never receive pay. He never tried to make a name in any form. He just was there to challenge and teach people. He chose young men because he believed they had the best influence to change the world moving forward. And so there were many that followed, and many influential individuals that followed. We know Plato was his disciple. Plato went on to disciple Aristotle, and Aristotle went on to disciple and develop Alexander the Great, a great lineage of development and leadership that took place. But many thousands of others were also influenced by Aristotle. So participation was absolutely identified. Did he, in fact, inspire and organize? Well, clearly that's the case because Plato, is 10 or so years after, was still writing about him, as was Aristophanes and Xenophon. They all were writing about him, and the culture of Athens had been built in large part based on his thought and his approach. And we today still look back at him as an example because he did inspire, and he organized the movement through his mentees that lives on today. But was he a decision maker? Well, if you have a chance to read the actual section that I'll have in my case study from the Apology, which was Plato's representation of what Socrates said to that jury, you'll find he absolutely was a decision maker, very decisive in what he said, and even willing to give up his life for the cause that he believed in. But what kind of leadership structure is best to examine him from? I tried to look at it from a servant leadership perspective, and while I agree, the 7 behaviors listed by Nordhaus of conceptualizing, emotional healing, prioritizing the follower, of growth and success for the followers, of adding value to the community, I mean, all of those are very present in his life, but the Apology doesn't reflect that type of approach. So I don't think that's the best way for us to look at it. Gender and leadership, that really isn't an option because at the time, gender was still very, very much an issue. Women were not allowed to be a part of the political structure at that point. Transformational leadership fits to some degree, but maybe not the most, because while yes, he did employ the 4 I's, he was not so much focused on that in the Apology again. So authentic leadership came to the forefront in my discussion. Authentic leadership was the one that most clearly was defined in his life. And so I want to build from that. Let's look at the different aspects of authentic leadership. We know from Nordhaus that self-awareness is a component. We know that internalized moral perspective, balanced processing, relational transparency, all are dynamics. Were they vivid or visible in Socrates' life? Well, self-awareness, absolutely. He was constantly challenging not just those around him, but himself. And we find that in the Apology and other areas written about him, he was very self-aware. as far as an internalized perspective, moral perspective, he died on principle. He could have gotten off on the charges, but chose to die because he knew that there needed to be a depiction of the great injustices of the day still, even with this new demoskrasia that they were experiencing in Greece. As far as a balanced processor, there may not be a better one as an example of a leader in history. He was objective to the nth degree, always evaluating not just others' thoughts, but his own, challenging them to ensure that they were in fact sound and reliable. In terms of relational transparency, that's probably the greater reason why people were so heart-stricken at his death. Not just Plato, but Socrates, a number of others were so heart-struck because he lost his life on principle, nonetheless, but still he lost his life. He was connected. He was always open, and the apology shows that in great detail. I've got to move briefly here. I would love to touch on the other components of that impact authentic leadership, SICAP with confidence, hope, criticism, and resilience, all very obvious in the apology that I'm choosing as a section to study. But he was an individual who was dedicated to the movement of free thought, of knowing what a good life was, of being able to decide for yourself what that would be. And so I believe that it is true that he was leading a social movement, that he was also an authentic leader who demonstrated those qualities in increasing level over the course of his life. And he was absolutely a model for us to benefit from as leadership academics, because we can look to him as an example of how it played out in a time far removed from our own, one also responsible for building to where we are today. I hope you have a chance to read my case study. I'm so excited about it, as you can tell. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to hearing your case studies as well. Thank you so much.